Thank you for your very, very kind introduction, both Sergio and Mario. So, as you can see from my picture, many years have passed by since I started working in telecoms, and I hope I can share some of our experience, not just my own experience, but the experience of our company that is advising and monitoring the global markets for telecom, media, and technology. I think I'm going to move here because this light is making me blind. Now, I would like to present to you, obviously you are an audience of experts, I would like to present to you the state of the MVNO industry as it is today, but also the direction that the MVNO industry is taking. There are a couple of examples I'm going to use. I hope some of these are going to be your own companies, some of these are companies maybe you are competing with. I apologize for that. In which case, I'm trying to put some thoughts around numbers, and I will try and give you the direction that this market is taking, but without forgetting that the bulk of this market is in a way the MVNO as we know it, but also the MVNO in a very, very different shape. Okay, this is probably the only slide I have in Spanish, so treasure that. So we are a consulting firm. I'm going to go very, very quickly on this. We work with the entire digital ecosystem. So we work with regulators, we work with other consulting firms, we work with operators and internet companies and media companies, just to give you a flavor of what we do. And we are part of a much larger group, which is called Informa. Informa is a listed company on the London Stock Exchange. It's fairly large group, and that gives us presence in many, many areas of the world. In terms of analyzing the telecom and media market, is about 150 of us analysts. I guess they only put the pretty ones on the brochure. But I'm one of the 150 that is constantly monitoring and forecasting the market. Having said that, let's get on to the matter of today's presentation. Let's look at what the MVNO is in some big numbers, okay? So the MVNO market today is roughly 200 million subscriptions. That means, you know, it's quite a sizable market. We're talking about the size of Germany, France, and Spain put together, which is not a negligible one. But the reality is that the MVNO is made up with more than 1,000 of small niche companies, some of which are very small, some of which are not that small niche companies. I always like to reference probably the largest MVNO in the world, which is the American Mobile Truck Phone, 20 million subscribers just in the US market. The reason why I mention that is because, yes, MVNOs are companies of few thousands or few 100,000 of subscribers, or 500,000 and so on and so forth, but the reality is that there are some really, really heavyweights out there. And finally, the MVNO market is in about 75 markets today, as Sergio was saying earlier on. It's expanding in terms of new markets. So every year there are a couple of markets coming on board. Now, maybe it's the regulation coming on board, or maybe it's without the regulation a new market is launching. So that is something that also happens. But this 200 million, which is a remarkable number, let's take it in global context. Now, let's not forget what the MVNO market is when we take it into a global context. It's about 3% of the market. Now, it's in those terms, it seems that it is a small niche. It's not that small. It's quite, especially in markets that are roughly everywhere saturating, is an important niche of the market. Of course, some regions are much larger than others in terms of MVNO penetration. Of course, we know the virtual operator market was roughly born in Western European, especially the Nordic markets. Of course, we know that US is big, but then there are, as we said earlier on, many other countries that are joining as we speak. Just to give you, there's a bit of an overlap on that slide, unfortunately. But just to give you an idea of where the market is today. So if this is the pie of the total mobile market, this little bit, it seems little in global terms, but it's actually quite an important one for a number of reasons, is the size of the MVNO today. And that other bit that is getting larger is the size of the MVNO market in the next 5 years. Today we are here, the 200 million I mentioned earlier on. In 5 years' time, we get another 50 million customers on board onto the MVNO market. Clearly, we have seen that Asia started, especially China, started having an interest in MVNO. And when we're talking about China, as we all know, when you say 1% in China, you're already talking about millions and millions and millions. So that makes everybody else look tiny. But in let's say, European or other more mid-sized market, when we're talking about a few million or a few 100,000 mobile subscribers, that's quite an important market. Now, this part is what we do. We crunch numbers, we forecast numbers, we talk to people. But later on, I also want to show you some data that comes from the MVNO community. Now, just to put into context, what is the size of the MVNO market today in percentage term of the total market? We very rarely see that a market is exceeding, let's say, the 10–15%. There are some exceptions, some very remarkable exceptions, and obviously the operator-owned second brands that are set up as an MVNO do move these numbers a lot. But the reality, when we talk about the MVNO market, in any given market, we are talking about 5, 6, 3, 8, 10% of the market. It's extremely rare to see markets that are going into the 15, 20, or exceeding the 20%, which, by the way, it's a huge share of the market. Now, I've highlighted a few markets that were already mentioned by Ingenium earlier on. Sergio mentioned Colombia, mentioned Chile, didn't mention Mexico, I think, or maybe. Those are all markets that are opening up. There are regulations coming on stream. The MVNO market is possibly, the players are very, very quick at moving, but everything that is around the MVNO market tends to be moving slightly at a slower pace. And when I'm talking about slower pace, I'm talking about the governments, the regulators, and the MNOs themselves. But nonetheless, it's a market that is happening not just in Western Europe, in Asia. It's a market that is happening in Middle East. It's happening in Latin America. It's happening in even in some African markets. So stay tuned for that. Now, those few numbers I presented are about the way we at Ovum see the market. We size it, we project it, we try and figure out what is the space of the MVNO business within the global context. But something that we do, and our partnership with the MVNO World Congress helps us a lot in doing that. We actually ask back people who work in the MVNO business, what is their sentiment of the market? What is their direction? Those are people like yourself in every country of the world working within the MVNO, and we ask them, so how do you feel about the business of MVNOs? And this is some of the results we get. So the industry is incredibly positive about its growth prospect. sometimes people say, well, good for them if they are positive about it. But it is important because this positive attitude underlines something that is really, really remarkable within the MVNO industry. MVNO industry is very much made up of companies that are extremely agile and very entrepreneurial in the way they do business. So we're not talking about the very big and slow processes that we see in some other parts of the market. And where those opportunities do appear, MVNOs tend to be fairly quick and going and grab them. So in the next 2-3 years, the industry itself, this is again from the voice of the industry, believes that MVNO will grow at the majority of the industry, anything in between, let's say, 10 and 25%. Sometimes I have a note to people and say, be cautious, do not overestimate your growth, because in many cases we see that MVNOs are over-enthusiastic, but this is the sentiment of the industry. So incredibly positive sentiment in the industry. When we ask people, where do you think growth is coming from? The majority, I know I highlighted the Latin American market because I know for many of you it's an important region, but it's not just that. So when we asked people, where do you see growth coming from a regional perspective, there are 3 engines: Asia Pac, Africa, Western Europe, interestingly, which is more of a refresh of the market rather than the existing MVNOs growing their customer base. And obviously Latin America has a role to play. Unsurprisingly, Latin America still is in global terms, I would say, relatively early days. I know there have been attempts many years ago in some markets, but the real market is really happening as we speak now. Just last week, just an example of Mexico, which is again only 1% of the MVNO market, and they have this Red Compartida, which is a wholesale only network. I think just last week they announced the first customer to become an MVNO on that wholesale network. So very early days, but still encouraging times. I will drill down on some markets. The market that gets us more excited in Latin America is the Colombian market. Is one of the first markets to open in big numbers, and it's also the leading example of MVNO activities in Latin America today. Things will eventually change in the next 2-3 years, but today we're still talking about the leading market in Latin America. And what sometimes I double check what things that I like people that are doing. And I know we as an industry love to look at the most innovative things out there, but sometimes we should not forget that playing to the core and rejuvenating the core, it's a really important play, especially for MVNOs. So many or the majority of the MVNOs out there are retailers, okay? If you are a retailer, what is your strength? Well, your strength is your core business. The MVNO is an add-on. So why not combining your core with the MVNO activity? So they just do promotion that are very much based on loyalty schemes, but not only the traditional loyalty schemes. Cable operators, for a cable operator, and this is another Latin American example, for a cable operator it's really important to cross-sell the cable base into mobile. So example of VTR Chile, which is another important MVNO market in Latin American terms, has already managed to get more or less 20% penetration of mobile onto their core cable base, which is again quite a remarkable number. And staying on this example of VTR, one thing that we observe in the mobile industry today, this is not just MVNO, it's mobile operators themselves, is that we all know that the SMS business, whatever happened to it. We all know that the voice business is largely compromised, but there are ways of differentiating data. So data is not just a pure bucket of megabyte or gigabyte. And what we observe is that those that are quite clever about it are essentially using applications like WhatsApp, like Twitter, like Facebook, like Instagram, Snapchat, and so on and so forth, or even the video applications, in order to create a segmentation within the data market. Data is not just one pure bucket. Data can be segmented. This is something I will never, ever be tired of repeating to anybody. Data can be segmented and should be segmented, otherwise it becomes a fairly cheap commodity. Now, and it's not just me or my company saying that data needs to be differentiated. When we ask again the industry, where do you see your top growth priority? Yes, the loyalty schemes, as we saw it, are important. Yes, the applications are important, data and the segmentation. But then there is another element that is surfacing when we are talking to MVNOs, and MVNEs specifically, which is the IoT. Now, something I always like to repeat is that the business of MVNOs is the business of niche. Now, let's do this parallel for once. The way that the mobile business started working with virtual operator was to be able to target some segment, some verticals, let's call it this way, or some niche of the market that they were not able to address with their core, let's say, Vodafone, Telefonica, Orange proposition, okay? And this is for a consumer market that is fairly homogeneous in the way it's composed. Now, if you transpose this argument into the enterprise market, where you have hundreds of different specialized needs, it's inevitable that the MVNOs will have a role to play in servicing some of the IoT business. Probably not the most common examples, but some are. But it's absolutely inevitable that the MVNOs will not have a role to play. And I'll show you some numbers later on. So on that point, when we ask again the market themselves, so people working in the MVNO business, what is your priority? Which one is your direction? What are the things that interest you as an MVNO or as an MVNO expert? And we play down a few things. I think Sergio mentioned already a couple of those. We see IoT, we see voice over LTE, we see advanced LTE Advanced or LTE Advanced Pro, but also we see 5G and eSIM. So those are all important topics to the MVNO industry today. Some are probably not imminent, but some are there already today. And on that, I would like to drill down on two of those, one of which being 5G and one of which being the IoT business. Now, okay, I'm showing this slide already, but I wanted to ask you, when do you think 5G is coming to your market, whatever your market is going to be? And I'm going to answer the question for you. Next year, before Christmas, we will see in some operators' shops already some 5G devices. Okay, so 5G is not a million miles away. And why is that important for an MVNO? The importance of 5G for an MVNO today is not to repeat the same mistake that was done with 4G. How many years, not months or quarters, did you wait for 4G after it was introduced by the main brands, the main operators? In many markets, the answer is too long, okay? So those who are working with MNOs today need to already now think about how to secure access to 5G networks. The same mistake that was done with 4G, as in, well, we have time, we'll think about it as and when, cannot be repeated. I know already, I'm based in London, so I know the British market fairly well. I know already many MVNOs in the UK have obtained access to the 5G network that is yet to be introduced by their host operator. So they have, and not only in the UK actually, in Germany that happens too. So securing access to future network is an important one. Especially 5G, it's becoming real. I don't know if you follow the standardization, but last week 3GPP, the second stage, was finally standardized, so there's nothing that is going to stop the network providers, the operators, and the device makers from accelerating the speed to it. So stay tuned, that is gonna happen. The other point I would like to make is on the IoT, and I have a couple of examples, but there are many examples already. In fact, some of the MVNOs are moving into the IoT market much faster than they did in the consumer market. There is already quite a number of MVNOs servicing the IoT market. Now, whatever you read or whichever research you read, that the IoT market is trillions and quadrillions of subscriptions. If you're happy with that, be happy. I'm not mentioning any Swedish report from Swedish vendors, but we count the IoT cellular market. So the mobile cellular IoT market, excluding LPWA, so low power wide area networks, is today roughly 500 million. That's 500 million connections. That market has been growing over the past years at a rate of 30–40%, and it has slightly, just ever so slightly, slowed down, but we're still talking about 25–30% growth year after year. The reality is that mobile operators so far have entered a couple of verticals, but the majority of them are playing very much horizontally as connectivity providers. But we also know that a lot of the opportunity within the IoT business is not just the connectivity segment. In fact, in some cases, the connectivity revenue is quite negligible compared to the revenue that is associated to the entire stack of the proposition. In that, and I guess it's very difficult to identify which one applies to you, but there is a role to be played in creating end-to-end proposition for a specific vertical or a specific application, which is something operators don't tend to do at all because of many reasons. But the reality is that there are many niches of the IoT market that should be exploited by an MVNO. And here I'm just like throwing a couple of examples of companies that moved into IoT business from an MVNO background. And we know the Brazilian Porto Seguro is an established MVNO, but there are some other small and not so small business IoT related MVNOs entering the IoT market. So IoT is very much of an MVNO play in the same measure, if not more, of the consumer business. And then I think I'm already overrunning my time, but I just want to leave you with two single bullets. One is data. Like really, it's most of what you have today as a provider of telephony, mobile telephony services. Data needs to be sliced, data needs to be rejuvenated, data needs to be updated. And when I say updated, I'm thinking about voice over LTE, I'm thinking about LTE-A or LTE Pro, and I'm also thinking about 5G. And the other point is, it's not just human, it's not just SIM cards for relatively low-cost calling, it's machines, and it's going to be an MVNO play. And on that, we are pretty certain, and we have already recorded a lot of it. With that, I will just thank you for listening, and I don't know if I have time for questions, but if I do, I'll be pretty happy to take some. Thank you.